Welcome to this month's Schuman Talk, where we discuss issues we face in Europe today in the light of Robert Schuman's vision for a community of peoples deeply rooted in Christian values. It was on the 9th of May 1950 at 6 p.m. that the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman gave a 3-minute speech in which he laid the foundation for the European house, where today 450 million Europeans live together in peace. That movement was rooted in forgiveness and reconciliation based on Christian values. Our guest today is actively involved in promoting these values contingent for freedom and peace. And we welcome to the studio Dr. Gudrun Kugler. She's an Austrian member of parliament, human rights activist. She's a theologian. She's an entrepreneur. She is a lawyer. She is a mother of 4 and very active on many fronts. And we're going to have a conversation about key issues facing Christians in Europe today, starting with freedom of conscience, religious freedom. So welcome, Gudrun, into the studio and to our Schuman Talk this month.
Hi, Jeff. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very much looking forward to talking with you. So many interesting issues. Thanks for having me.
Last week, we were together in Brussels for the European Prayer Breakfast, and you participated in a panel discussion in the European Parliament about religious freedom. And so it gave me a chance to hear some of your passion for this topic. So let's start with a basic question. What is religious freedom?
You know, often people have said religious freedom is one of the most important human rights, if not the most important. And it took me a long time to come to terms with that, because, I mean, obviously look at all the other human rights. But it does make sense to see religious freedom as something that directly concerns a person's ability to search truth, to express who they are, and engage with the world in a most intimate level. And you know, I like very much Viktor Frankl. I'm sure you're familiar with him. And as obviously being Austrian, he is also very important for us as a country. And he wrote a book while he was in a concentration camp. It's called Man's Search for Meaning. I'm sure many know it, but those who don't, it's really a great thing to read. It's foundational. Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. And in this book, he asks the question, who is a human being? And he says the human being is the one who always decides who he is, right? So this deciding who I am is very much related to my human rights and especially to religious freedom. It really decides in my deepest core who I think I am. And as another dimension, I think with life experience and also when you read the great philosophers, you see that religion plays quite an important role because it seems that philosophers see very often the human soul is not being satisfied with what they find in the material world, right? They say, oh, even if everything's perfect, you have everything you want, it's still never enough. You're always out of time. You always have to, squeeze yourself into a structure that's not really yours. There's always a hunger for something bigger, something transcendent. And in this context, I think we can see that the human person is a deeply religious being. Now, our secular world doesn't acknowledge that, right? In our secular world, you go back to Marx and Engels, who say, well, a religion is opium. It's just to keep the people quiet. And then you have the maybe the more nationalistic movements that say, oh, religion is just for weak people. So we have a strong disregard, a disdain for religion. And Jeff, you said we just saw each other at the European Parliamentary Prayer Breakfast. Yes. And you know what? One of the reasons why this is important is to say that faith is just, part of everything. I mean, we don't want to take it out of some aspects of our lives, right? Besides, many other reasons why it is meaningful to do this. And so maybe there's one more thought to add, and that is that very often people see religious freedom as mainly a human right to allow people not to practice religion, which is, of course, also part of religious freedom. So freedom from religion, which is also true. But there is other dimensions. It's also freedom to practice your religion, and freedom to change your religion, freedom to organize your life according to your religious convictions. That's the personal dimension, but there's also an institutional dimension that says, if a group of people from a certain religion gather and then they say, oh, why don't we found a school or a hospital or an NGO and we do good things, that it's really part of institutional religious freedom that this institution, these people create, can also practice their common religion the way they want it. And we see in Europe these days quite a lot of frictions with regards to the personal, but especially to the institutional dimension of human freedom, of religious freedom.
Yeah, and a little bit, but I want to go back to Viktor Frankl. He was not a Christian, but he was a Jew. Is that correct?
He was a Jew. Yes, absolutely.
He was speaking out of his Jewish understanding of human beings from the Bible as being created in the image of God with the ability to choose. And so much of what he was saying in his search for meaning is that a human being could still have be in prison, but still have the freedom to choose to do the right thing.
Right.
So this was brought out also by the speaker in the prayer breakfast about the freedom. A true freedom is the freedom of choice to do what we ought rather than to do what we want and just follow our passions.
Right. I mean, very often we tend to see people nowadays as just victims to their circumstances, and then victims of their circumstances. How can they do the right thing? It's not possible because they are victims of their circumstances. So I think it's really important for us to see that even within difficult circumstances, it's still you taking a decision. And yes, obviously it's not as easy as it is in other situations, but it's still you. You're still free. And Viktor Frankl says sometimes you are not able to change your circumstances. Like, I am locked in a concentration camp, and all the things they are doing to me and to my fellow inmates are, as terrible as you can possibly think it of. And here we are, yet able to choose between good and evil. So it's not up to us to constantly, just whine about what's going on around me, but to make sure that in the context I still do the right thing. And it's quite touching to read it with all the examples that he's giving.
Now, a lot of people have the idea that these freedoms and leading into human rights and so forth came out of the Enlightenment. Would you comment on that?
The understanding of human rights, including religious freedom, goes far is far earlier, goes further down history than only the Enlightenment. We have seen, I think, also already in the Jewish understanding of how they wanted to organize a state and how they also saw the impact of religion, that there was already quite an understanding of human rights. And I also think that the 10 Commandments are very much related to respecting human rights of other people. It was certainly good that in the Enlightenment these rights got formulated and that they received a lot more respect. But they would not have been formulated had they not already been somehow innate in our European philosophical understanding. And remember that there's a beautiful image how to describe what is Europe. And really, when you ask about the Enlightenment, it's very much related to what is Europe. And that is the image of the 3 hills. To say that Western identity, and again, Western is not a geographical concept, but that European Western identity that could be lived anywhere in the world, no matter the geography, is based on 3 hills. One is Rome, the Capitol Hill, which is the hill where Roman law and rule of law was born and then spread throughout other countries. And then Athens, the Areopag Hill, where democracy and Greek philosophy really was founded, and then it spread from there. And then the 3rd hill, Jerusalem, Golgotha, where the Judeo-Christian vision of the human person really came to this one point of of point zero in history than from where it made its way. So you take these three things together, and you come to a basic view of the world and of the human person that then leads up through the centuries to something like the Enlightenment, where we can now say we have come to a very good understanding of who is the human person, what is the role of the state. But then on the way, we have made many mistakes, and we have fallen back. We have, run into blindnesses, but then we moved out of these again. And as doing so, I think we can really employ the term, we were stumbling uphill. And there's two more thoughts that are very important to me as a politician. One is that as we were stumbling uphill, we were still stumbling. And I think the 20th century was the worst ever. People call it the outbreak of great evil. That's true. But then what people do not add is that the 20th century was also the century in which these evils were overcome, right? And think of 4 generations of Soviet communism. So the people in the 4th generation, they didn't have grandparents who had a humanistic or Christian education, right? They only had propaganda for their entire lives, including their parents and their grandparents. Still, in 1989, these people walk out of communism, close the door, and they say it's not right, it doesn't work. And this image, I think, is so important for us to understand that human rights and that idea of the 3 hills is not just random. It's not just one philosophy. You can, take it or leave it. But it goes much deeper. It really fits to who is the human person. And it gives us also a lot of hope that you could see nothing worse has happened than what we can imagine in the 20th century in different places. And, for me as Austrian, I'm totally deeply affected also as being from a country that was a perpetrator. But not only, right, I'm aware, but also. But still, people closed the door and they moved on, and so they went uphill. And then there's another image that is very helpful, I think, for me, is Cardinal Newman's words saying every time has its own heresy. Every time has its own blindness. And we look back into history and we see all these blindnesses, right? And we are very good in naming them because we are taught what it was about and we can read in history books and so on. But then what, does our time also have a blindness? Well, maybe yes, and maybe we should talk about that. And when it's a blindness, it's particularly difficult to talk about. And in history, it's been very often also Christian groups that have said, no, we have to change this. Look at the abolition of slavery or women's right to vote, women's suffrage. These things were also brought about through Christians, not only, but they were a motivating factor. And so now a big question really is, what is today's blindness? And I mean, as we know with all blindnesses, the sooner we understand them, the better we are in overcoming them.
If we can go back to what you said about Rome being the source of rule of law, etc., Athens, and the huge contribution that both the Roman and the Greek tradition brought to the European identity. When we look at Roman law, we see a real deficiency. We see the way Jesus was treated. He was found to be innocent by the Roman official, but he gave in to the crowd. Paul had to. He was the Roman official was trying to bribe him. So even then, at that stage, wasn't rule of law as we understand it now. It has to be said that it was filtered through a Christian filter through Justinian, the Christian emperor, later on, who gathered all these Roman laws and put them through a Christian filter, as it were, to give us the Justinian law. So even when we talk about Roman law, it has to be qualified that then was interpreted through Christian lens. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, probably. But there was also a lot in Roman law that just made sense by how society works and how people are. I mean, I'm by training a lawyer. I had to do 2 semesters of Roman law, and all of these things dated back to before Christianity became prevalent in Rome, and it still made a lot of sense.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, what in the Catholic tradition is very strong is the natural law that all truth is
Yeah.
God's wherever it comes from. Yeah.
I
Now,
mean, uh, sorry if I
mm,
may, just may add to your point. As you can see God's image and likeness in people and creation, right? It's creation that points to the Creator. So you don't even need to say, Christianize everything. If it corresponds to human nature, it's already in correspondence with also Christianity, right? And I like a lot Pope Benedict's speech in the German Bundestag in 2011. A German Pope gives a speech in the German Parliament, quite interesting. And he says there that the term natural law is kind of old-fashioned and people don't get it. But he says, let's call it differently. Let's speak of ecology of man, ecology of the human person. And it's totally true. If you do away with human rights, then it's just not going to be ecological for people, right? If you tell them in communism, you don't have any rights to property and you don't have any freedom of expression and freedom of conscience, it will just not work because it's not ecological, like the same way you take a polar bear into the Dominican Republic. It doesn't work, right? But that phenomenon of that within the human person, you can see what works and what doesn't. Like C.S. Lewis spoke of a manual of the human person. That is just something that we can see that proves itself in social data all the time. And that for me as a politician, I just need to also make sure that we make laws that are not in violation of what the phenomenon of the human person is.
this obviously is involved. This implies freedom for all religions, not just the Christian faith. And when it comes to, we use the term religion as if it's just people who go to church or go to a synagogue or go to a mosque, but everybody has a belief system. Everybody's worldview starts somewhere with presuppositions that have to be taken in faith. So a person who does not believe that there is a God, that's their faith position. So do you see, what is the situation regarding freedom of religion in Europe today, which is supposed to be a civilization that was shaped by the Judeo-Christian tradition? Where are we at in relationship to freedom for Christians, freedom for Jews, freedom for Muslims?
Stumbling uphill. I think we have come a long way, and there's many good things, and people try to be tolerant and try to accommodate each other and work with each other. But then there are, I think, still a number of issues that we have to work on. Women in Vienna that wear a headscarf, Muslim women, they say to me, there isn't a day where they are not being harassed in public transportation on the streets. And I think that's just so ugly and it's terrible. And I remember that I was on the subway and there was a woman in a headscarf, wearing a headscarf, and she had 4 kids with her. And the people were pushing her around. It was absolutely outrageous. So I just went in between and I talked to her and I admired her children and I tried to be nice. But I think if this happens to you a few times a week, this is really ugly. And I think we just need to be better. At the same time, it is true that migration causes problems and that maybe there's cultural clashes and then makes people angry. And we also have to be better in solving this. I mean, we know that with migration and different faiths, or you could say different expressions of faith that are already present, because of some cultural background and upbringing, we do have problems that we didn't have before. It's an issue of anti-Semitism, of how to value and respect women. It's an issue of accepting democracy and accepting majorities, which is also something very unique to this European context we described. But it also goes as far as cultures where there is a concept of blood vengeance, right? And these things for us, and we don't want to tolerate that. So we have to be, while we uphold religious freedom, be very strong with things that just contain a huge package of violation of rights on a different level.
So it doesn't mean tolerance of all that has been involved in the cultures associated with those religions. This is as Europeans, we provide a framework of acceptability. I think when we think of the post-war era, where we saw so many transgressions of basic human rights, This was a time where the new world order with the UN and what eventually became the EU, etc., or the Council of Europe as well, all set up to safeguard these human rights. What was the role of Christianity in setting those safeguards?
If you can dig deep into Christianity, you will see an incredible appreciation of human dignity, right? Because this is how you best describe image and likeness of God. A Catholic document, Familiaris Consortio, says having a child means passing on the image and likeness of God. So you see people around you and you see them as image and likeness of God. Also, you see them as children of the same God, right? So the idea of one father already does away with the idea of racism. And I know there were mistakes committed and there are mistakes committed, and history shows all of that also. I'm aware. But the idea of one father is very strong. And then one father also means gives us a new definition. It gives us a new definition of charity. So if you love the Creator, the Father, you will love the ones that He loves. And then you have a very different view of looking at the world and at people. And from this, I think, flows not only a forced upon respecting human rights, like I cannot kill you because I'll go to prison and I shouldn't. No, but you have a deep appreciation of the other person. And also our human discourse must never be diminished to the idea of rights, right? It's not just me not being mistreating you because you have a right, but also because much deeper than this, I affirm your dignity. And sometimes our human rights dialogue is very impoverished. For example, we say, oh, we have to go and help starving children in some region in Africa because they have a right to food. And then for me as a lawyer, this is complicated. Like, what? Right to food? How do you explain this? How do you justify it? Who's responsible? That's very complicated in a way because it's not solvable. So when somebody speaks of a right to food, what it means is to signalize an urgency. Oh, yes, there is a problem. People need our duty to help. But the real reason is not a human right, and it's not codified anywhere. But the real reason is that we affirm the dignity of the starving child, right? So our human rights dialogue should not be impoverished by being restricted to rights, but it should contain the language of dignity, of affirmation, of value, of charity, and of love. And then there's another element of impoverished human rights dialogue, and I think we see this a lot nowadays. In a way, on the one hand, people claim, human rights, whatever they feel like. There's a right to this, a right to that, and it's not checked against philosophy, not against the law. But then within the existing human rights documents, people then pick and choose. And I realize that, for example, a religious freedom, when it comes to the friction areas with secular society, nobody takes religious freedom seriously. Or in the Convention of the Rights of Children, it says, for example, there's a human right for a child to know its genetic parents. And then again, nobody in politics takes it seriously. So, we do anonymous sperm donations, and I keep going around saying we need a database. We need to give a chance to the people to ask who is their father, and same is true with egg donations. Nobody does it. And then I say, well, it's a human right. And then I get no response. And it's just, people don't care. So we see on the one hand a galaxy of human rights. And on the other hand, we see a pick and choose, whatever is politically opportune. And then we see an impoverished rights dialogue where we do not go further to see that there is an even deeper level of us affirming dignity. So human rights, a great concept, shaped by Christianity, super important, but then we have challenges today that we need to look at.
Well, coming back to the question of religious freedom, where do you see the greatest dangers in Europe now?
Well, we see in Europe quite a number of hate crimes against religions, and we see vandalism, we see arson, we see hostile attacks on churches, graveyards, and that is true for different religions. Since October 7th, we saw, of course, a very strong rise in anti-Semitism and attacks against Jewish life. And I think the number we use for Austria is that these attacks have risen by 300%. And so it's so sad to see that there's Jewish people in my country who say we weren't afraid for many decades, but now we are afraid. We also see these attacks happening against Christians. This is maybe also new information for some. In the OSCE hate crimes report that is published every year, it's about a fourth of the cases that are hate crimes against Christians. In 2020, I dug out the numbers for you. We had 4,008 cases reported, of which 980 were directed against Christians. So we need to see that too. And a lot of this is vandalism and arson. And it's also vandalism of Christian tombstones and obviously churches. I have priests, parish priests in Vienna that say to me, like every other week, somebody comes in and leaves excrements in the chapel, and they just have to clean it out. And it's a way of them showing hatred, and so these things are happening.
Where's this coming from, Gudrun? Is it the polarization in our society? Is it the rise of the far right, or is it other sources? Where is it coming from?
Well, all of these things have, many different reasons. I don't know if I don't think this is the far right doing it. I think, and maybe some people are just mentally unstable. That's probably also true. But then all of these things have a history, and they have things that these people were listening to and internalized. But I think that there is a deep misunderstanding of what is Christianity that leads with some people then to such manifestations. I can give you an example, which I also think is almost a discrimination against me as a Christian. I was once invited to speak on a panel of the Austrian branch of Black Lives Matter, and none of the other center politicians, conservative politicians, wanted to go there, but I went because I said, okay, if you have issues in Austria, I want to know, because I want to help you. Like, tell me what is the problem. This is why I went. And they asked me to introduce myself and to say something, and I began. I said, so I'm here to support you because I'm a Christian, and for a Christian, I believe in we have one Father. And when we have one Father, there's absolutely no space for racism, right? But that's all I needed to say. They freaked out on me. They got so angry, and they did not let me continue speaking. And I didn't get it for like the first few minutes. I'm like, what's happening? I mean, I just said what is my personal motivation of why there's no space for racism. And then I realized that in their minds, it was Christianity responsible for all the terrible things that happened to their countries and that happened to their to whatever in their personal lives. And now I am here saying, oh, Christianity doesn't have space for racism, right? And here, obviously, it's true that in history also things were not always right. I mean, no doubt. And also, as many other institutions and other religions, there were many mistakes, and understanding needed to grow. Stumbling uphill, absolutely. But then there were a lot of good things that came through Christianity that opposed racism. And I know that now everybody, I mean, somebody who is authentically a Christian, forgive me to say, but cannot possibly be racist. I mean, or I don't know, feel free to disagree with me, but this is what I feel very strongly. So, but in their minds, it was all the dialogue they've had over so many years, all their understanding of the world was full of hatred, right? And so I would understand that out of such a mindset, somebody could go and set fire to a church. It happens, right? And so what do? I think talking, trying to understand each other, where we come from, and stumbling uphill together might be a solution.
Now, you mentioned that there is a rise in the numbers of discriminations against Christians, attacks on Christians. And it was also mentioned in the panel you were part of last week in Brussels that countries like France, UK, Germany were even mentioned, that especially Germany and UK have got strong Christian backgrounds. What is going on here?
Yeah. I guess we can say that the period of secularization that we are going through now, a very strong secularization, has just such side effects. Moving away in history from being understood as Christian nations, now moving to nations that are completely secular, contains some friction. And that those frictions, they are maybe normal, and it's a new way of doing things, and we need to learn that. That's all good. But we have to really work hard towards achieving a mature understanding of faith and of living together with different beliefs and backgrounds. And we can do a lot better there, I think. You know, a mature attitude to religion and faith. It's a fact that religions are out there and people have faith. So we might as well develop a spirit of cooperation. And in Austria, we've had this through the Habsburg monarchy already for 100 years or longer. We had a religious freedom law, an institutional religious freedom law, that there was space for different religions. And for example, 120 years ago in the Austrian Empire, in the military, there were people of different faiths, there were Muslims, and of course, they would get a spiritual chaplain from the Muslim faith in the Austrian military, right? So this spirit of cooperation and having space for everybody, I think, was exemplary. And in some countries, we are not at this point, and we need to learn that. So that means for me, cooperation of saying, yes, there are religions, and yes, we're grateful, and yes, we work with them, instead of either ignoring them or dominating them. The pandemic was a good example. In some countries, some countries told religions what to do and when to open the church and when to close it and how many people were allowed inside and so on. In Austria, we had a panel of all recognized churches, and the state would meet with the panel of all churches and say, so here's our suggestion. What do you think? And then the church would say, well, okay, we'll do it this way. And normally they would agree. But it was the churches deciding and the state respecting from the first minute of the conversation that it's not the state going up to the church and say, this is what you have to do. On the one hand. On the other hand, I think we need to understand better the term accommodation. So if there is a clash between secular society and religious faith, it should not be the wish of secular society to extinguish the faith and get rid of it, but to say, okay, this is important to you. It's not important to me. I hear you. I will try to create space for you to be comfortable and be part of society anyhow. And we were not good at this. And if you look at some of the issues of legal restrictions between legal restrictions where Christians don't feel completely free in Europe, you will come to the point of, can we not accommodate everyone? And so for me, developing a mature attitude to faith and religion from the side of the state is absolutely key. Stumbling uphill, we are on the way, but we have not yet arrived.
Well, it's quite ironic that we often see secularism pitched against Christianity when the very word secular is a church word, and especially in the Catholic Church. You talk about the priests working in the secular area, and it's actually a word that you find in the Latin version of the Lord's Prayer. It has to do with this current age. Even the French word for century, siècle, comes from the same root, and just understanding this differentiation between the here and now in this world compared to the transcendental is actually a Christian concept. And so often we've heard also that first they come for the Jews, then they come for the Christians. Is this what we're seeing happen again?
Maybe it's more complex than saying it's just a form of of climbing up a ladder. I think there's also very different foundations for where these things come from. There was a former UK foreign minister, Jeremy Hunt, who said, so why are we not able to give a better answer with regard to persecution of Christians across the globe as Europeans, right? And I want to, before I give you his answer, I think you should look into a few examples. Remember when the Sri Lanka Easter attacks took place and like 250 people were killed on Easter Sunday, right? And a German foreign minister tweeted that he's dismayed by the attacks against praying people, right? He didn't mention the word Christian. In a similar alliance, we had Pentecost Sunday shootings in Nigeria 2 years ago, if you remember. 40 people were killed. And the EU commissioner then said that he's very unhappy about the scale of violence which targets Christians and Muslims alike. And it's just not true, right? And then he says, oh, and the root causes is climate change. I'm like, can we not get a better answer? And then in Nigeria, the bishops made a statement saying, this is incorrect and it is far-fetched and you're just not seeing the problem and you're not being helpful. So we see these things. And there was a Syrian a patriarch who came to Vienna to meet with my prime minister, and I was there and we had a very good conversation. And he said, for us in Syria, where we are being targeted and persecuted, we suffer twice. We suffer once by just being targeted and persecuted, and we suffer also because the West, who we consider our brother, sister, family, is just not interested and doesn't see our suffering. It doesn't help us. So then Jeremy Hunt, former UK foreign minister, had a study done on these things. And he said, yeah, it's actually true that the global phenomenon is really harsh and very serious. And then we don't have an appropriate answer to this. And the reason why he gives is because he says it's partly because of political correctness that we avoid confronting the issue. Right? He says we have a misplaced worry that it is colonialist. That it's colonialist. Yeah. If we say, oh, stop targeting Christians, because in our view, we see, oh, the Christians are those better off and they're, in these superpositions, and now we defend those people. But in truth, the Christians in the countries we are talking about belong to the poorest people on the planet. And we need to get over our own hesitation to say what is right and necessary to help the poorest people, because in our minds we have a wrong understanding of colonialism and political correctness.
Well, take the current situation in Syria. Aleppo has fallen, and other places are falling to these rebels. Now, we have very little being covered in our Western press about the fact that Christians are actually being beheaded there, and the existence, the ongoing survival of the Christian community there is dangling on a thread. But everybody thinks, well, this is all a total Muslim country, and we don't get involved. We've got a lot of religious illiteracy amongst our politicians and media people, which brings a misunderstanding as well. Now, in the panel that you were part of last week in the European Parliament building, there was a statement made by the representative of the Committee of the Catholic Bishops in Europe, and he said that the time has perhaps come for the appointment of an EU coordinator on combating anti-Christian hatred. What's your comment on that?
Well, yeah, that's a strong statement, but I guess it's true. You see, I am very active with OSCE. I'm a vice president of the Parliamentary Assembly, amongst other functions. And at OSCE, we have this function. We have 3 special representatives.
CE, can you explain that?
Yes, the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is, you could say, something like the United Nations for the Western world. I mean, I know that's legally not correct, but just to help you see what it is. Government institutions, governments meeting, and parliamentarians meeting across 57 countries. And And there we have three special representatives with regard to religion, combating hatred against Jewish people, Muslims, and also Christians. So there are quite a number of things that if somebody looked into discrimination of Christians in Europe would actually find. And maybe it would help us to mature quickly, and as we stumble uphill, to come more quickly to results. You know, Pope Francis said about Europe, there is a polite persecution disguised as culture, modernity, and progress. Disguised as culture, modernity, and progress, polite persecution. And John Paul II, 20 years earlier, he said, Christians in Europe are not being whipped or murdered, but they can die a social death, right? And so, you're very well aware of the debate about cancel culture. I see that happening. You know, personally, I get asked at least once a month by a newspaper if I feel discriminated against as a woman in politics. And honestly, I don't think I have. Maybe I didn't notice, but no, I haven't. But I feel discriminated against as a Christian in politics all the time. And I have to be 5 times better and smarter to be 1 time equally recognized. It's just the way it is. So, I mean, we cannot now make laws against it, but I think it's good to be aware to say, hey, are we having a mature approach? Do we accommodate everybody? And yes, is it okay that an MP is a Christian? Well, excuse me, why not, right? But we need to still get to that point. And also, Jeff, excuse me if I keep talking so much. I realized that when we look into European laws in different countries, we see legal restrictions for Christians. Sometimes there are also legal restrictions for other religions, but I looked at them with a view on what it means for Christianity. And we see a number of laws across Europe where freedom of conscience is not fully granted. Where, for example, medical staff, pharmacists, medical students have to do things that they feel they cannot do while they uphold their faith. And this extends to the issues of beginning of life, end of life, some things maybe with research on stem cells. Then we have an issue with parental rights. When we try to make sure that parental rights are guarded, it means that the parents have the right to decide on the education of their children. We have an issue in some countries which homeschooling, which is forbidden and more or less made very difficult. And then sometimes there's an issue with the way sexual education is done, and the parents are not being asked, are not drawn in, don't know what's happening, and things they would object to then being taught to their children. We have an issue with freedom of expression. That is, for example, with overboarding hate speech legislation, also, on social media, what you can say, what you can't say, sometimes has as a side effect, targets the expression of somebody's convictions. We see very striking issues with homilies, sermons, preachers, clergy, bishops running into trouble. Then we have the area of right to assembly and funding of NGOs, where it's sometimes, forbidden to pray in a group in a certain area. We've had one super striking case of a person alone standing in the proximities of an abortion clinic silently. And the police approached this person and said, "What do you do?" And I don't know if it was a man or a woman. The person said, "I'm praying." Said, I'm just standing here. They said, "Do you pray?" They say, "Well, in my thoughts." And then the person got arrested because it's forbidden to pray in the proximity of an abortion clinic. And that's ridiculous.
And this is in England, yeah.
This is in England, yes. And and then, can a faith-based NGO apply for public funding? In some countries that's becoming difficult, right? And there's also, it brings me to an aspect in development cooperation. If we want to, for example, end FGM, which is very important. Then for me as a human rights person, I work a lot on ending FGM, and it's not just a problem in other countries, it's also happening in our countries through migration, right? So we cannot end FGM if we only work with international NGOs. We also have to work with local churches and respected people, right? But we don't, because we think it's not politically correct. So we will not end FGM, and we are not helping the people. Sorry, Jeff, do you see what I'm saying?
Explain that for your audience. FGM.
Sorry, yes. Female genital mutilation, right? In a way, what happened to the desert flower, right? So how can we end this? It's not enough to say, oh, let's give money to the Red Cross and they will tell everybody. Because in somewhere rural Sudan, they will not listen to the Red Cross, but they will listen to the local imam. And if we can win him, we will protect these little girls. And if our way of engaging with other countries excludes faith and religion and churches, then we'll just not get as far as we want to get in protecting people.
It's a form of colonialism, isn't it? It's a secular colonialism.
Yeah.
Now, just two last questions, Gudrun. I want to thank you and all of those like yourself who have dared to enter the public arena. What would you say? How can a young Christian who wants to be involved in the public square be equipped for this job? Because it is a concern of mine that there are very few academic courses that train people from a Christian point of view to enter the public square. How would you encourage young people to become, well, I'll call them saints in suits, because there was a time when Robert Schuman, the French foreign minister who actually initiated the whole process of European integration, was considering becoming a monk. And a friend of his encouraged him, no, you must continue with your law studies and go into politics, because the next generation needs to be saints in suits. How would you encourage young people who are considering following in your footsteps?
Wow. Saints in suits. I like that. It's really good. I think we know that society is ruled, our countries are ruled by, in a way, a handful of people in key positions. It's not just parliaments, obviously not just government ministers. But if we want to create societies which are fair and just, and which respect human dignity, and which respect human rights, and as we discussed, religious freedom and respect religious freedom, then we just need to do something for it. And one of the popes has said, I think it was Pope Francis, I said, he wants to see a good Christian, he wants to see on the street, meaning engaging for something worthwhile and not leaving things the way they are. So we have as Christians, as obviously every person has it, but as Christians, we have a very special calling to create an environment in which human dignity is respected. And that means in our personal environment and the people around us, in our charity, in us seeing the faces of people and hearing them and helping them, but also with regard to how our society structures and what our rules are like. And for many years, maybe Christians have not so much paid and haven't paid so much attention to it. And maybe there was also a little hesitation, because they said, oh, if I become powerful, I might, get corrupted, and I might only think of myself, and I might develop pride, and then I'm not a good Christian anymore. And that is a wrong fear. We always, in whatever we do, have to make sure that we stick with our principles, but we cannot avoid an entire profession or an entire world that is so important for creating the way we live together, just because we're afraid, or we might lose our virtues. You don't have to. You can be a politician without without losing your virtues. Yeah. So a German bishop once has said, punish the party not by leaving it, but by entering it. Right? So we're not politicians because our party is our religion. It's not, and our party is not perfect, but you go to places that are not perfect in order to make them better. And then in all of this, we just have to always remember that we guard our inner peace and joy. Because sometimes you could look at things and be like, oh my God, what's happening? Does it make any sense? But for me, as I work on so many issues, and some work well and others don't work, mainly not my fault. It's just the context and the circumstances. I say, I tried my best. I know why I'm doing this. And it didn't work. Okay, it's not my fault. I will move on and take up the next thing. And in all of this, just keep peace and joy. And then it's the adventure of your life.
Well, you've already started to answer the second question I was going to ask you, and that was, what can ordinary people who are not called into the public square, what can they do? And you've already started to answer this. Do you have any further closing comment you'd like to make?
It's the politics is not restricted to the public square. Virtually every comment you make on social media, a letter to the editor you write, an email you send to a powerful person is all already part of politics. And I think, like the Scouts, remember the Scouts, they say one good deed every day. I think in our public debate, what can everybody do? Raise their hand in a debate, say something meaningful. Everybody can do a good deed every day. And I think our public discourse urgently needs this, even if you do not have a business card that says I'm a member of parliament. And I'm very much inspired by the way communism was brought down. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn, when he was to leave Russia, the Soviet Union, and he didn't want to leave, he had to. He just left as a message for his countrymen, his fellow countrymen. He said, just commit to never to lie again, right? Don't applaud if the thing is not applaud worthy. Don't pay for the newspaper if it spreads lies. Don't vote in favor of something if you know it's wrong. And if you are brave enough for this, it's super difficult. But if you have this courage, you don't even need to give great speeches that explain the world to everybody. But that will bring down a system that is built on lies, right? And so whatever our blindness is today, it's on all of us, no matter in what position, to stop lying, stop acclaiming things that don't deserve being acclaimed. And that will already change a lot.
And that was hugely inspirational for Václav Havel, who later became president of the Czech Republic. Don't live the lie, live the truth.
Mm-hmm.
He was also inspired by the reformer Jan Hus, who lived in Prague, and who always said truth prevails. So I think that's a good way to round off this discussion. Thank you, Gudrun. I know we could talk for much longer, but thank you very much for all your passion, your engagement for what is true in the public square. And it's been a delight to have you with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Great to talk to you.
And our next month's guest is going to be a Baptist theologian, Helen Painter, who has contributed to a book called The Church, the Far Right, and the Claim to Christianity. And this is also speaking to a very a current issue in Europe today, as we hear many far-right parties which seem to be talking about Christianity and the Judaic-Christian heritage as something they are defending. Is that really what is behind this? And Dr. Helen Painter will be exploring that for us next month. We look forward to seeing you again.